Good evening, everybody. I want to thank IICF for their generous donation to Covenant House, and I'll get to Covenant House in a minute. I'm very happy to be with all of you. Usually I talk about current events, but events happen and change so quickly, and I've been told I can only speak for 5 minutes, and that's a little longer than the modern news cycle. I don't want to give you a view on something and then have it change. There's surely somebody's going to either drop out of the Democratic race or get in the Democratic race by the time my speech is over. And there's got to be a hearing going on somewhere. In addition to covering the news, I write about history. I write about the presidency. I just handed in a book about the presidency, not this president, but the presidency. It's about how the office changes. So, for example, when James K. Polk was president, his wife was so worried that he would walk into a room and nobody would know who he was, that she told the band to play Hail to the Chief, which is now why that's played when a president walks in every room. Of course, when he basically picked a fight with Mexico and created the Mexican War, then people knew who he was. Even on Twitter, they knew. But now the president is a part of our daily life. He's a part of American culture. He's probably the most famous person on the planet. So we notice when the president doesn't show up. And that's how he got in the business many of you are in. As I understand it, you are involved in the casualty insurance business. You're there when there's a disaster and things go wrong. And you volunteer to give back to your communities, $9 million, as I understand it, that you've raised. And those two things combine into a story about how the president became a part of disaster response in America. As you know, when a disaster happens, the president is supposed to show up afterwards and distribute water or ice or pack sandbags, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, in 1956, there were a string of storms that hit the East Coast. It was the worst storm system of hurricanes that we'd had in American history. And none of the newspaper stories mentioned the president, President Eisenhower. You would think the Allied commander would be in the room getting briefings, furrowed brow, getting maps. No, the only stories about Eisenhower when these hurricanes were hitting was how he was on vacation. And they weren't stories about how it was bad that he was on vacation because there were hurricanes hitting. They were stories about how he'd stopped playing golf to go fishing. Because you could take vacation back then when you were a president. And why? Because no one expected a federal response to disasters. In fact, Eisenhower argued that, in fact, if you asked for a federal response, it would sap the community feeling that you all demonstrate, and that the IICF demonstrates in giving back to the communities from which you all come. Eisenhower said, I regard this as one of the great real disasters that has engulfed us, that we are unready as a nation to meet personal disaster with our own cheerful giving. And he said that if you intervene and have a government doing it, then the individual and the family will no longer be wrapped as a part of their community. So what happened? Well, how did that change? Well, television news is to blame, as it is for many things. What happened? Well, television loves a drama. There's nothing more dramatic than a disaster. So Edward R. Murrow was the first person to fly into the eye of a hurricane. NBC hired weathermen so that they would know where to put the cameras before the disaster hit. And if you have a big, huge, and Dan Rather was in local news until he went out and did a piece from in the middle of a massive storm, and they called him up to the big leagues. When you have a big national drama, what do you need? You need a president to play the lead actor. And that president was Lyndon Johnson. On the 9th of September in 1965, massive hurricane Betsy hit Louisiana. It was the devastating hurricane before Hurricane Katrina. And Senator Russell Long of Louisiana called the president, and we know about this because Lyndon Johnson tape recorded every phone call, well, most of the phone calls he had. No, really almost every. If you go on YouTube and search LBJ and Hager pants, you will have an entertaining evening ahead of you. Anyway, this phone call was a little bit more sedate, and it's from Senator Russell Long, and he said, Mr. President, aside from the Great Lakes, the biggest lake in America is Lake Pontchartrain. It is now drained dry. That Hurricane Betsy picked it up and put it in the 3rd Congressional District. Mr. President, my people, they're in tough shape. But Russell Long also knew something else, and that's what this story is about, which is that politics, which is an unpleasant business, can sometimes have good results. Senator Long ended by saying, if you go to Louisiana right now, Mr. President, they couldn't beat you if Eisenhower ran. Louisiana would not necessarily always vote for a Democrat. So Johnson pondered it, and his disaster relief official said, don't go, the weather's bad, you can't do anything. And again, we're talking about politics here and how politics can sometimes lead to a good end. This was Johnson's response. Again, God love him for recording it, recorded in a phone call. Before reading you a brief transcript of it, it's important to know that President Johnson's daughter, Lucy, was 17 years old. This is Johnson talking to his disaster official. Here's my problem. Damn it, when I ask a man to do something, I want him to do it. And I've been asking Russell Long all year to do things, and he's had to do a lot of things he didn't want to do. And he's emotional. And they feel like nobody cares about them. And they feel like a 17-year-old girl. I want to let them know that they're loved. I have to pet Lucy sometimes when I don't want to because I don't want her to run away from home. So in case you missed it, the president just compared the senator from Louisiana to his 17-year-old daughter. So Johnson goes down to Louisiana, and what he saw was devastation everywhere. People had gone up into their attics to escape the rising floodwaters, and the water had risen to the roof and they had drowned, which is now why a lot of people keep axes in their attics in Louisiana. A man had run up to him and screamed that his child had died. He went into the Washington High School where there were no lights and went down into the basement where people, mostly African Americans from the 9th District, were eating carrots off of paper plates. That's all they could find. So he came back to Washington and he worked very hard, and the Washington Post had this headline in the following days: LBJ assumes charge of day and night relief operations. Chicago Tribune reported President Johnson, only hours back from an on-the-spot inspection of Hurricane Betsy, orders extraordinary federal aid. The New York Times talked about the president working night and day. Well, the presidency is a very frustrating job. Mostly they feel, as Johnson said, that in the presidency sometimes it's like being a jackass in a hailstorm. Sometimes you just have to stand there and take it. So presidents like to be able to do things. They like to be able to make quick action. And so the president was able to act, and after that he built into the office this expectation that you now as a president must show up and you must be there for your fellow Americans, and that it's part of the federal role to be there for Americans. And every subsequent president also wanted those kinds of headlines. But that spirit of local communities that Eisenhower worried about, it still exists, which is why I'm very, very grateful to work with Covenant House, and I'm so grateful for your gift to Covenant House tonight and your donation to them in their effort to help end youth homelessness. You know, in our political world, there's almost nothing that happens without someone judging another person's motive. And Covenant House operates on the precisely opposite principle. Kids come to the door of Covenant House and they are not judged. They are often there because they have been judged and they've been kicked out of their house or kicked out of society in some other way. And they are greeted and they are lifted up and they are taken care of physically and mentally, and they are given a hot shower and a warm place to sleep. And what is extraordinary to see is that when all of the madness is put aside and they are treated with love and respect and no motive questioning, what they can do when they are actually allowed to exhale for a moment. And as somebody who's been involved in Covenant House, and I'm sure you all feel this way in your communities and in the volunteering that you do, to be in the presence of grace like that, to be in the presence of people who are so effortless in their giving to other people, not just with the checks they write, but in the minutes that they spend every day, it's really an honor to be a part of that and to watch them do that. And so I want to thank all of you for the donation and for your commitment. And now you can get back to checking your phones and see if there's some news that's broken. We may be at war with Canada or something. Thanks very much.